Okay, thanks, Keith. Thank you for those kind words. Can you see my screen?
Yep,
Not.
it's perfect.
Oh,
Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I see 55 people. That's lovely. Thanks very much. And thanks for that great introduction, Keith. So I'm very pleased to be able to join today and share some of the results of our project, which was called Beyond Beetle. And I'm going to specifically focus on the component that relates to what our future forests are going to look like. So lodgepole pine stands in west central Alberta beyond the beetle. And this portion of the work was conducted in collaboration with Vic Leifers, my colleague in the department, Julie Steinke, who is a master's student on the project, and Laurie Schrader, who was a research assistant with this. Okay, so let's have a little lead in here. We all know all about mountain pine beetle, and we just heard more about it from Keith here, so I won't go over that part. Let's just think for a moment about lodgepole pine as a species. So how does it regenerate? It has serotinous or semi-serotinous cones, so they need to warm up and break the resin in order for the seeds to be released. It's going to regenerate best on mineral soil so that the seedling can get its radicle and its root down into nice moisture conditions to support the growth of the seedling. It does, it's shade intolerant, but it can regenerate under its own canopy if the shading isn't too extreme. And later in succession, if the stands don't burn, it might be replaced by shade tolerant species such as spruce or potentially fir. Okay, so it is adapted in Alberta anyways, it's adapted to its historical disturbance regime, which is wildfire. And wildfire creates conditions which support regeneration of this species. So wildfire removes the overstory, providing lots of light. It removes the organic layer and creates a nice mineral soil seed bed. Fine fuels are removed and the heat itself of the fire is going to be able to open the cones. So that's the conditions under which lodgepole pine has been regenerating successfully through multiple disturbance cycles since forests established post-glaciation in Alberta. What are the conditions after mountain pine beetle? Well, after mountain pine beetle, the overstory continues to stand. So the trees die and they lose their needles slowly as they move to the red attack stage and then the gray attack stage. But the trees remain standing for some number of years, maybe 10, maybe 20 or more years. And those standing dead trees are going to shade the forest floor. The forest floor is undisturbed, so there's going to be no removal of the LFH layer and very little exposure of mineral soil, so there's not good seed beds for pine to establish. There is not going to be heat that's going to open the cones unless the cones fall to the ground and find themselves in a sunny spot. They might heat up enough for the resin bonds to break and to open up. And the other thing that's going to happen after mountain pine beetle, of course, is that fuels are created by the dead trees, and that poses a concern about wildfire. So as Keith explained, our objective with this study was to say, okay, what happens to these lodgepole pine stands in Alberta after they've been attacked by mountain pine beetle? What is their future in terms of regeneration and succession? And a part of the project I won't talk a lot about, we looked at what some management options might be for them. So we can start with, what happened in BC. What did we learn in BC in terms of what happened to stands after mountain pine beetle? They found that the cones did eventually open on the dead trees in the canopy, or they fell to the ground and were exposed to enough heat to open up. But in general, there was very poor natural regeneration of lodgepole pine, and it was delayed 10 plus years before we started to see it. So more at the stage where the dead tree started to fall and create microsites and create more sunlight on the forest floor that provided opportunities for pine to regenerate. Advanced regeneration was very important, particularly shade-tolerant conifers and residual live trees. So either live pine or live trees of other species that were in the stand. And the stands tended to regenerate to some mixed composition that was comprised of what was left standing after the mountain pine beetle went through and what the advanced regeneration was. So that's what happened in BC. There's some important differences between Alberta and BC in terms of our lodgepole pine forest. So obviously it's drier in Alberta, and this has implications for seed beds and the type of seed bed that's needed. So in a moister forest, it might be easier for a seedling to establish through a thick forest floor, but if it's very dry, a dry duff layer is not going to be a place where the lodgepole pine seedling is going to be able to establish. There's differences in terms of the amount and diversity of advanced regeneration. As you probably all know, that our pine forests in Alberta tend to be more monospecific, just pine or pine and a bit of black spruce, sometimes a little bit of aspen or white spruce. So there isn't much, or there's many of those types of stands that don't have much in the way of advanced regeneration that could take over. There may be differences in the level of serotiny. There's some suggestion that serotiny might be stronger in Alberta populations. And there were also differences in terms of the level of mortality caused by mountain pine beetle. So all these differences made us believe that it's possible that the future successional development and regeneration of these stands in Alberta would be different than it was in BC. And so we needed to get some Alberta specific information. Okay, so we first wanted to look at natural regeneration in these stands, and our objective was to look at what natural regen was occurring after mountain pine beetle attack, and we did this in two different components of the study. So first of all, in lodgepole pine dominated stands that had a high level of mountain pine beetle attack, and for a variety of ecosite types. And then we did a broader study that involved permanent sample plot data from a wide variety of ecosite types and a wide variety of mountain pine beetle mortality levels across the province. And we were trying to answer the question, what best explains the occurrence and density of regeneration? First of all, how much density of natural regeneration there is, and what explains higher or lower levels of it. So in the first part of the study, the pine regeneration in pine-dominated high mountain pine beetle mortality stands, and we call this like a best case scenario for regeneration. So we went across the province and found sites to study. They had to be more than 70% pine in the canopy, greater than 50% gray attack stage, low advanced regeneration, no management for mountain pine beetle. We tried to cover a range of ecosites, and we sampled them 6 to 9 years after mountain pine beetle. So at a stage where we figured if there was some regeneration, the seedlings would be big enough that we'd be able to find them without crawling on our hands and knees throughout the sites. So we sampled a wide range of sites of this type across west central Alberta, and collected data on the ecosite, the advanced regen, the canopy composition, the mortality, the microsites that were available, the ground vegetation, and we searched intensively to find pine seedlings. And it's important to note that in this part of the study, we established plots in areas that we thought we were likely to find pine regeneration. And we did this for a couple of reasons. One is because we wanted to sort of see what the best case scenario was for regeneration in these sites. And the second reason was that in a lot of sites, we could have wasted hours and hours and days and thousands of dollars searching areas where there simply were no seedlings. And if we can't find seedlings, we can't find the factors that are going to facilitate establishment of seedlings. So that's an important thing to remember about this part of the study. So what we found is that we did find some pine seedlings in 14 of our 33 sites that we sampled, so about half of them, and about half of them also had some pine advanced regeneration in them. And when I say pine, it's mostly lodgepole pine. A few had jack pine or lodgepole pine jack pine hybrids. Okay, so despite the fact that about half of them had seedlings, the densities were very, very low. So this is a frequency distribution. So we see a lot of sites that had no seedlings, and then the sites that did have seedlings had a wide range of densities. This is number of seedlings per 4 meters squared. So you can see that some had pretty high density in those plots, and then it goes down to basically finding one seedling within that area. So in discounting the zeros and where regeneration did occur, the mean density was 3.2 seedlings for 4 meters square, which works out to 8,000 trees per hectare. So that's pretty good. But again, you have to remember that this doesn't include all the areas where there were no seedlings, and it is biased towards plots where it was likely to find seedlings. So we found, a number of situations where we'd find a plot and there'd be a lot of seedlings right in that plot, but the rest of the site might have none. The other thing we wanted to look at is how does site quality influence regeneration? So we see that here, the percent of plots of different site quality that had seedlings or didn't have seedlings, so poor, medium, and rich. And we did this by dividing up the ecosites along the edotopic grid for the different natural subregions that we sampled in. And you can see that poor sites were much more likely to have seedlings than rich sites. So it goes poor, medium, and rich. So the poor, dry, and nutrient poor quality sites had higher levels of natural pine regeneration. And we can see examples of that here. So here's a couple of these sites in the boreal mixedwood in the upper left there, a bee ecosite, so poor nutrient and moisture regime, an open site, you can see lichen, a low duff layer. And this is the kind of site where we were more likely to see pine regeneration. And then in the lower left, on the boreal mixedwood again, we have an ecosite, much richer and moister, and you can see the understory growth there, the shrub cover, the forb cover sites. Some sites like this had fireweed up to your neck, and yeah, no self-respecting pine seedling is going to be able to establish on a site like this. So we did a fancy analysis, and I'll save you the details of that model building exercise that was designed to answer this question: what best explains pine regeneration in pine-dominated stands when they have high severity attack? And so on the positive side, being a poor or medium quality site versus a rich site, it was going to increase the probability of having pine regen. And sites that already had pine advanced regeneration was an indicator of a site that's going to have pine regen. And that's not because the pine advanced regen is causing regeneration. It's just that that's an indication that that's the kind of a site that is suitable for getting ongoing establishment of pine. On the negative side of the equation here, rich site quality, sites that had more spruce basal area or broadleaf advanced regeneration were much less likely to have pine natural regeneration. Okay, then we'll look at tree regeneration across a variety of forest types and levels of mountain pine beetle attack. And so this is a much broader look at the range of ecosite types and mortality conditions that we would find in West Central Alberta. You can see the map there showing all the sampling sites. So this was derived from data from 205 permanent sample plots that were sampled between 2014 and 2017. These data were provided by the government of Alberta, Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, covered a variety of forest types, so pine dominated, but also mixtures of pine and spruce and fir and mixed sites. And the mountain pine beetle induced mortality ranged between 0 and 100% with a mean of 57%. So this gave us a much wider range of conditions to look at in terms of what the outcome would be as a result of mountain pine beetle. So we had similar kinds of data from these plots. They were PSPs, so they had been sampled one or multiple times and had good information on the ecosite and the canopy, advanced regeneration, understory, and whether there were seedlings. So in this case, over this much wider range of sites, pine seedlings were only found in 14 of 205 sites. And the mean density was 37 trees per hectare. And if we took out the zeros and looked only at the sites where there was some pine regeneration occurring, the medium density was 250 trees per hectare. So overall, extremely low levels of pine regeneration in these sites. Again, looking at how site quality influenced pine, so matching with the results that I just presented, looking at number or percent of sites with seedlings for poor, medium, and rich quality sites, and we can see overall it's quite low, but again, we see this trend where poor quality sites were more likely to have seedlings and more likely to have a higher density of seedlings than were medium or rich sites. And again, we went through a model building exercise to say what best explains pine regeneration. And on the plus side of the equation, again, we have poor or medium quality sites, percent pine in the canopy, and pine and spruce advanced regeneration. Those sites were more likely to have pine natural regeneration. Again, probably percent pine in the canopy indicates it's more of a pine kind of site and there'd be a seed source there. Pine and spruce advanced regeneration suggests that it's a site that has conditions that are suitable for ongoing regeneration of trees in the subcanopy. On the negative side of the equation, rich sites again, higher levels of live overstory. So areas that had lower level of mountain pine beetle mortality were less likely to have seedlings. And sites that had broadleaf, either in the subcanopy or as advanced regeneration, were much less likely to have a natural regeneration of pine. And this seems obvious that that is likely a shading effect. The other thing we wanted to look at in this group of sites is what else might be coming onto these sites after mountain pine beetle. So tree ingress onto the sites. So some level of regeneration or ingress was found in about half of the sites in this sample. So 115 out of 205 sites had some natural regeneration of something else. A large number of these was broadleaf species coming in, so mostly aspen, maybe some poplar in some cases, spruce, either black spruce or white spruce coming in, and then sometimes other conifers, balsam fir, or sometimes even tamarack coming onto some of these sites. So that looked a little more hopeful that some of these sites are getting ingress of other tree species. Looking at the frequency distribution. So this is all regeneration. So the mean density of regeneration overall was just over 1,700 trees per hectare. And where regeneration occurred, the median was 1,250 trees per hectare. So I'm looking at the median because you can see this is a very skewed distribution. There was a few sites that had, well over 20,000 stems per hectare. In a small area, really high density of regeneration, but largely they're grouped to below 5,000 trees per hectare. And again, you see a large number of sites, about half of them, that had nothing occurring. Looking at all tree regeneration now, what was the influence of site quality? So again, not as strong an effect as on the pine regeneration, but still we see lower probability or lower percentage of sites with regeneration if they were rich sites versus medium and poor. Medium and poor are about the same, so around 60% of medium and poor sites had some regeneration, whereas only 46% of the rich sites had regeneration. And again, the density follows a similar trend. So the density of regeneration, trees per hectare, was just over 2,200 on poor sites, 1,600 on medium sites, and 1,400 on rich sites. So again, there is this influence of site quality, and that very likely speaks to the influence of competing vegetation, likely shrubs or forbs on the richer sites, preventing natural regeneration of the tree species. Looking at what species we're establishing, we can see here on poor, medium, and rich sites. So we have densities here that follow the table that you just looked at, and the colors indicate the species. So on medium and rich sites, there was a preponderance of broadleaf regeneration. On the poor sites, actually, spruce was the dominant in terms of regeneration. Often that would have been black spruce. And you can see pine, the really tiny pine bars there that are slightly higher in the poor than in the medium or the rich. And in some cases, there was some fir and tamarack, as I mentioned. Actually, in the rich sites, there was a fairly substantial component of the regen was either fir or tamarack. So again, we did a model building exercise to say what explains tree regeneration overall. On the plus side of the equation, sites that had broadleaf advanced regeneration or spruce advanced regeneration or fir and larch advanced regeneration were more likely to have ingress. So that again just suggests that there is a seed source, or in the case of broadleaf advanced regeneration, there's roots that could sucker. and support ongoing regeneration. If there's some openings in the canopy or a microsite that's suitable for a conifer seedling to establish on those sites, they're going to be able to do that, and that's going to support ingress. And on the negative side of the equation, shrub cover was a strong influence. So that goes back again to what I said about the richer sites. They're more likely to have heavy understory vegetation, shrubs or forbs, and that's going to have a really strong shading and competitive influence that will really inhibit the establishment of other tree species or ingress onto the site. So looking overall at what might replace pine in terms of advanced regeneration on different sites here, and we can see the pictures at the bottom. We have pine seedling and a spruce seedling, and then some aspen suckers coming up in the sites. And you can see trees per hectare of the different possibilities. So we can see that broadleaf species and spruce dominantly would be the species or types of species that would be established on these sites as advanced regen, and thus could potentially replace pine in the canopy by growing up. On poor sites, as I mentioned, more likely spruce, and on medium sites, either broadleaf or spruce establishing. Existing subcanopy, what might replace pine? So predominantly in terms of an existing subcanopy was spruce. Again, that was often black spruce. In the low trees per hectare, but could potentially replace some of the pine that would be lost from the canopy of these stands. Okay, so that's the story of natural regeneration of pine and of other species ingress into these types of sites after attack by mountain pine beetle. The final part of this that I want to present is a story where we wanted to look at what the landscape scale implications were of this. So we wanted to look broadly across the west central portion of the province, particularly the part that's the merchantable pine zone, and look at what proportion of sites were on different site qualities and what levels of mortality were. So for this, we used data that were provided by Alberta Agriculture and Forestry. So we used derived ecosite phase data. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. So it's based on AVI with enhanced attributes and a bunch of LiDAR-derived data sets. Covers 7 million hectares within the study area. And these data were provided by Bev Wilson and Mike Willoughby. So this gave us a layer of ecosites and ecosite phases for this large region. And then we had another data set that was provided by Brooks Horn, again from Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, and this is a mortality classification. So this was based on high resolution aerial photographs between 2013 and 2015. In which they were able to identify dead trees, either gray or red attack stage, and they classified stands as having different levels of attack. So greater than 10%, greater than 25%, greater than 50%, or alternatively less than 10%. So we had nice coverage over a large area of the province that gave us ecosites and then the level of mortality that was experienced in those same stands. So this is just like, where is our pine within the merchantable pine zone in the province? So lots in the foothills and Boreal Highlands natural subregions, less in the mixed wood and very little in the subalpine. And this is both in terms of proportional area and in terms of the actual area on the ground. If we look at just the pine ecosites, what's the distribution of poor, medium, and rich? So we wanted to look at this because we knew that we had some information that told us that poor sites were likely to have a bit more regeneration than medium sites, and rich sites were likely to have very poor regeneration. So the question was, of the pine that's out there, which sites are probably more concerning in terms of not having good regeneration? So in the Boreal Highlands, there was a larger proportional area that was on the rich ecosites that are the ones that are going to have extremely poor regeneration. than there was in the foothills or the mixed wood regions. The dry mixed wood separated from the central mixed woods in terms of having a much larger proportion on sort of a medium site. Central mixed wood had the large proportion on poor sites, so that's the ones that are going to be best, even though not that good, but better than others in terms of levels of regeneration. And subalpine, a large proportion of the pine on subalpine was in rich sites, which are expected to experience very poor regeneration, but overall subalpine didn't have much pine. So we're not going to worry much about that later. So this gave us an idea that, particularly the Boreal Highlands would be of concern because they have a lot of pine, and a lot of that pine is on poor or rich sites that are going to have poor regeneration. And after, the next most concerning would be upper foothills and dry mixed wood for those same reasons. So then we asked whether mountain pine beetle mortality varied among these natural subregions. So again, this is just for the merchantable pine, and we have of the proportional area that was pine ecosite phases, what was the proportional area that was in different mortality classes. So the purple is less than 10%. So overall, lower proportions had experienced any mortality. The highest was in the upper Boreal Highlands, where slightly over 30% had experienced some level of mountain pine beetle mortality. If we just take the area that had mortality, how much of it experienced the different levels, we can see that in the lower right here, and see in particular that upper foothills overall had a little lower proportional area that was in the 25% or more mortality class, whereas the upper and lower Boreal Highlands and lower foothills and the two mixed wood zones had higher proportions that had higher levels of mortality. So now we're narrowing in a bit on where the pine is, where the sites are of concern because they're likely to experience low levels of regeneration, and the sites that are more likely to experience higher levels of mortality. Finally, separating all the different natural subregions, looking at whether mortality varied by site quality and therefore by anticipated natural regeneration. There weren't huge differences here. So we have the lower and upper foothills on the left here, and the differences between poor, medium, and rich sites. For lower foothills, we see slightly higher levels of mortality on medium sites. For upper foothills, we see slightly higher levels of mortality for poor sites. So that's somewhat less concerning because the higher levels of mortality are on sites that are more likely to experience natural regeneration. Opposite kind of trend for the Boreal Highlands. So both the lower and upper Boreal Highlands, you can see that rich sites also had higher levels of mortality. So you'll recall that more of the forest in these regions was on rich sites, and rich sites are now experiencing higher levels of mortality. So that indicates that this is an area that might be of particular interest or concern if we're going to have higher levels of mortality, particularly on the site types that are much less likely to have regeneration. Central mixed wood here, again, a higher level of mortality on rich sites than on poor sites, and in the dry mixed woods, it was actually medium sites that had slightly higher levels of mortality. So this indicates again, although there was less overall pine on the landscape that was in these two natural subregions, there is some concern if the mortality is higher on the site types that are less likely to have natural regeneration. Okay, conclusions in terms of pine regeneration. So overall, very limited natural regeneration of pine on sites that have experienced mountain pine beetle attack. More common in poor and medium quality sites, more common if there was pine in the canopy, likely because it's an increased seed source, so that's going to support pine regeneration. And if there was pine in the understory, it suggests that it's a site type where the conditions are suitable to have ongoing ingress and regeneration of pine, probably a lower density canopy and a forest floor conditions that are supportive of seedling germination. If there was a remaining live canopy, especially spruce, then you have shading conditions and poorer pine regeneration. More broadly, tree regeneration, broadleaf and spruce regeneration was most common and in the highest densities. Advanced regeneration is indicative whether pine regeneration can be expected. So if there was some pine and spruce advanced regen, suggests conditions may be slightly more suitable for pine seedlings to establish. And if there was broadleaf advanced regeneration, conditions were quite poor and the outlook was quite poor in terms of pine regeneration because those broadleaf species are going to outcompete and shade the pine. At the landscape level, upper and lower Boreal Highlands, about half of the pine in these areas was on rich sites, which are likely to have very poor regeneration, or medium sites which had lower regeneration. Upper and Boreal Highlands also experienced higher levels of mortality, and richer sites had slightly higher mortality. So all this put together puts a bit of a target on these site types as being a particular concern when we're thinking about the future down the road and what kind of regeneration or whether we're going to get any regeneration on these sites, or in terms of prioritizing sites that need some kind of treatment to facilitate regeneration and future successional development. Lower and upper foothills, more of the pine forest was on medium sites that are going to have lower regeneration than poor sites, but a bit better than rich sites. They overall had lower mortality. And then in the lower foothills, medium sites had slightly higher mortality. And in the upper foothills, rich sites had lower mortality. So that was on the plus side, because the sites that are less likely to have good regeneration also had lower mountain pine beetle mortality. Dry mixed wood, more of the pine was on medium sites that are going to have low regeneration, but not as bad as rich, or poor sites that had some regeneration. Dry mixed wood had higher mortality overall. And in terms of the differences between sites, rich sites had higher mortality in the dry mixed wood, whereas in the central mixed wood, poor and medium sites had higher mortality. So this helps us get a bigger picture in terms of what the outlook is more across a range of ecosites and across the province in terms of the areas that are of most concern in terms of future management and successional development, regeneration of these sites. So what are the implications overall, the future for our pine forests after mountain pine beetle? It seems that tree composition might shift away from pine in the canopy. Broadleaf species and spruce that are present in the stand might take it over and might experience release growth and become the future canopy. Rehabilitation might be needed to maintain pine, especially in richer sites. So the areas I think of greatest concern are these rich sites that could potentially move towards more heavy shrub cover and have very poor regeneration of pine, and perhaps poor regeneration of any tree species in the future if they go to heavy shrub and forb cover, and that really just prevents trees from establishing. Okay, quickly, other parts of the project. We did have a part of the project where we looked at partial harvesting and site preparation as a possible management option in areas that weren't going to be salvage harvested. We did find some evidence that this was potentially successful. The partial harvesting disturbs the forest floor and opens up the canopy and supports some slightly higher levels of natural regeneration, and then site preparation creates some nice microsites. So if you have, leave some trees on the site that would provide a potential seed source, and then open up the canopy a bit, create some microsites for establishment, can potentially get some nice natural regeneration on the site. And this was all without posing substantial wildfire risk. So Mike Flanagan had a master's student who looked at the wildfire risk of this treatment and didn't find anything of particular concern. Another part of the project, which you may hear about in this webinar series or may have heard about already, was done by Dr. Nadir Erbilgan and his PhD student, Violet Zhao. And they were looking at the properties of the residual live trees, so the trees that aren't killed by mountain pine beetle. And they found some really interesting stuff. In particular, found some evidence that those trees that managed to survive through a mountain pine beetle attack and stay alive on a site might have actual resilience or resistance to mountain pine beetle. And so leaving those trees on the site as a future seed source could be really beneficial if they're going to produce offspring that have those same properties, if those properties were genetically based. So this had to do with the resin structures in the wood and their ability to put out a volume of residin that might potentially pitch out the insects and then result in the tree being resistant. So that was a really interesting result. Quickly, some of the management implications. So sites that had low levels of mortality and high levels of advanced regeneration, you might want to just leave these and let them go. They might not necessarily go to pine, but you'll have some trees growing on these sites, and they'll transition over time and potentially provide a source of fiber in the future, and also just continue in a forested condition for all the other values that you would want on the landscape. If there's a medium level of mortality and richer sites with low advanced regeneration, these are sites that perhaps should be targeted by silvicultural treatments to facilitate natural regeneration. And then if there's a medium level of mortality, it would be worth it potentially to leave the live residual trees on the site as a future seed source, and potentially a seed source that would produce offspring that might be resistant or more resistant or resilient to mountain pine beetle in the future. Sites that had very high level of mortality and rich sites with low advanced regeneration, these are the ones with the poorest outlook in terms of future future recruitment and regeneration of pine, or indeed any other tree species. And those are ones that perhaps should be prioritized for salvage logging, since we know salvage logging will almost certainly result in good regeneration of these sites back to pine again. It follows the normal harvesting and silvicultural treatments for that type of site. We produce some products from this to aid management decisions. So there's a field guide and pamphlet. If you'd like, if we were in person, I'd be able to hand you out copies of this because I have a box of them still in my office. But I would also be happy to mail them to you or send them to you electronically. So you can contact me and get copies of those if you like. We also produced a virtual field tour, which is available on YouTube. We were going to show it to you here, but we couldn't figure out how to get it so that you could hear the audio, but we're going to share this link with you, and it's open available on YouTube. It's just under 6 minutes long, and it provides an overview of the project and a little bit of a walk through the forest, which is always good. So I want to thank the funders of this research, the Forest Resource Improvement Association of Alberta, Alberta Innovates, CAN4, Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, and of course FRI Research. Collaborators for the partial harvesting part of the study were Derek Sitters and Tim Keddy from Canadian Forest Service. Very grateful to the field assistants for data collection. These individuals really had to show great resilience and patience, driving all over the province and spending a heck of a lot of time searching for pine seedlings that they did not find. And then, as I mentioned, the permanent sample plot and derived ecosite phase and MPB mortality data provided by Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, Kenstat, Brookshorn, and crew there. So the project wouldn't be possible without that. I'll end there and happily take any questions.